All right, today we're diving deep into the official data from Japan's labor force survey for the fourth quarter of 2025.
Hello, this is Japanese Economic Review Channel. This detailed government data is where we really get to see the story behind the headlines, what's actually happening with jobs, unemployment, and the workforce here in Japan. So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First up, we'll look at a really interesting shift in employment. Then, we'll zoom in on the non-regular workforce. After that, we'll check out the latest unemployment numbers. And finally, we'll explore something called Japan's untapped labor potential. It's a fascinating concept. All right, let's jump right into our first section. The big story coming out of this quarter's data is a pretty fundamental change in Japan's job market. We're seeing a really clear pivot from one type of employment to another. So check out this first number. It's a big one. We're talking about a 750,000 person increase in regular full-time employees compared to this time last year. That is a huge signal of growing demand for stable, long-term jobs. But here's where the story gets really interesting. That growth in regular jobs, it didn't just happen on its own. At the same time, we saw a 320,000 person drop in non-regular employees. So what this tells us is that it's not just about creating new jobs, it's about a real allocation of the workforce. And this chart really drives the point home. These aren't just random blips on the radar. Look at those trend lines. Regular employment has been climbing for 11 straight quarters. And on the flip side, non-regular employment has now dropped for 2 quarters in a row. The evidence is pretty clear. This is a sustained shift in the market. Okay, so even with that drop, there are still over 21 million people in non-regular roles. And that brings us to our second section. What's really motivating them? Why are they in these jobs? Let's dig into what's driving their choices. And it's a really important question, right? Is this something they're choosing, or is it a necessity? The reasons people give for taking these jobs, well, they tell us a whole lot about the pressures and priorities in Japanese society today. Well, the answer is overwhelmingly clear. The number one reason, and this is from over 37% of people, is the desire to work at convenient times. Flexibility is absolutely king. So this isn't mainly about a lack of other jobs, it's really about lifestyle and wanting control over your schedule. And what's happening inside these motivations is just as telling. Think of it like a balancing scale, right? On one side, the desire for flexibility is getting heavier. That group grew by 290,000 people. But on the other side, the weight of financial need is getting lighter, with 340,000 fewer people saying that's their main reason. This shows a clear shift away from just needing the money and towards making a deliberate choice for a better work-life balance. Okay, now let's flip the coin and look at the other side, unemployment. We've talked about people who have jobs. Now let's see what the situation is for those who are actively looking for one. Now, at first glance, the headline number shows a little bit of an increase. The total number of unemployed people rose to 1.9 million. That's up 110,000 from this time last year. But, as always, the real story is in the details. So the big question is, who makes up this increase? Well, the data shows the rise comes almost entirely from people who've been unemployed for less than 3 months. At the same time, the number of long-term unemployed, we're talking people out of work for a year or more, that number held steady. This suggests we're seeing more short-term transitional unemployment, not a spike in deep structural joblessness.
And this leads us perfectly into our final section, which is maybe the most important one of all. See, to really get a handle on the health of the labor market, the standard unemployment rate just doesn't paint the full picture. We need to look at it through a wider lens.
And that wider lens is this concept of underutilized labor. It's a key idea. Basically, it captures everyone whose potential isn't being fully tapped by the economy. Think of it as a much more complete health check for the job market. So this measure is actually made up of 3 different groups. First, you've got the officially unemployed people we just discussed. Second, you have the underemployed. So think of someone working part-time who really wants and is available for a full-time job. And third, there's the potential labor force. These are people who want a job but aren't actively looking right now. Maybe they're caring for family, or perhaps they've just gotten discouraged. So when you add all 3 of those groups together, you get Japan's most comprehensive measure, which is called the LU4 indicator. And for the fourth quarter of 2025, that number comes in at 6.0%. Just think about that. It reveals a pool of available labor that's more than double the standard unemployment rate. And this chart really puts that 6.0% into perspective, showing it in a global context.
And while there's always room to improve, Japan's rate is actually quite a bit lower than what we see in other major economies. For instance, it's well below the 8.1% in the US, and it's less than half of the 15.0% rate over in France.
So let's just quickly recap the big takeaways here. First, there's a major structural shift happening. More stable, regular jobs and fewer non-regular ones. Second, the reasons for doing non-regular work are changing. It's more and more about flexibility, not just financial necessity. And finally, when you look past the standard unemployment number, you see this significant 6% of the labor force that remains underutilized.
And all of this leaves us with a really critical question for the future, doesn't it? As Japan's job market shifts towards more stable work, the next big challenge is, how do you unlock all that hidden potential? How do you tap into that 6%, the underemployed and those on the sidelines, to really power the next wave of economic growth?
Thank you for watching the Japanese Economic Review. We look forward to having you with us again.